I often like to think about this question in terms of like what shaped me, looking at the about me question. And um, so, a couple of like biographical things are that I'm Canadian born and raised. I was born in Toronto and raised there, and I now live on the west coast of Canada in Vancouver. But what shaped me is the fact that I came from a family that is Jamaican rather. I was raised by my mother and my sisters. My sisters are quite a bit older than me, so that was part of our family dynamic. And I grew up in very different circumstances that I live now. I definitely didn't grow up with a whole lot of income. And also, I arrived in a family that was, going through some tensions. My parents had split up while my mother was pregnant with me, and there were some consequences to that. And so I had arrived at this family that was, you know, kind of dealing with some stuff. And um, I I found myself often kind of being alone. And even though I had two older sisters, because they were so much older than me, they were pretty much like not around. Like one was even like out of the house, um, and so there's a lot of things when I think about the things that shaped me. When I look back with knowledge that I hold now around colonization and understanding racism and understanding oppression, and I realized that for most of my years, I could say, or for many of my years, I kind of grew up with an understanding that the judgments that I was receiving, and these are judgments and behavior that I was experiencing, largely because I'm a Black female identified woman in a big body. um, I was receiving a lot of judgments and criticism. And for a very long time, I kind of took that on as my identity. I understood myself based off of what people were saying about me, essentially. So um, those are the kind of things that shaped me, um, certainly in my youth. And as I grew older and moved into a more professional setting, I would say that that tendency to understand myself based on other people's judgments about me, or basically living a life through the lens of colonization and systemic oppression, also meant that in the workplace, I really, really struggled as well. And so those experiences has really shaped what it is that I'm doing in my life now, and where I choose to put my time and attention. But essentially, uh, so much of what I've been through has shaped where I am now, and shaped what it is that I do, and shaped the things that I care about and that I'm passionate about. So right now, I am largely focused on on the question of what does it take for people who come from traditionally marginalized backgrounds to be able to show up in their full humanity in the places that they work, that they live, and that they play. So that's kind of like the fundamental question that's at the bottom of almost everything that I do. And it crosses over in terms of personal and professional. I don't really have separate kind of entities. That's the question that I'm looking at oftentimes in my life. And how I arrived at that place was that I realized I was taking on a lot of consequences and receiving and being impacted and harmed with this orientation of living my life through the gaze of other people. And so I became really curious about um, how I could have a bit more choice about what was happening in my life, and also about how I was feeling about myself. And so as a teenager, at least from that time, I had been doing work around anti-racism and anti-oppression. And when I learned anti-racism and anti-oppression work and was in those activist spaces, the orientation was very much one of kind of calling things calling things out and calling people out. So if someone did something that was racist, like you called them a racist, like that's how I was trained initially to do kind of anti-racism work. But as I started to look at this question, identifying myself as a person who is traditionally marginalized and wanting to look at on what it would take for me to step into my own humanity, that's where I kind of landed on and came to an understanding around the impact of colonization and began to engage in work around decolonizing my own understanding of myself and just decolonizing my way of thinking. And this was an important piece for me because, as I've mentioned, I come from a Jamaican background, and I don't know if this is known by most people, but Jamaica is a place that exists for the purpose of enslavement, essentially. So there are people, most Jamaicans are people of African descent, but people of African descent are not native to the island of Jamaica or any of the West Indies. The people who are native to those islands look like Native American people in Canada, in the US, in Mexico. They're not of African descent. And so what that means is that for everything about the identity that I grew up with is actually colonized. It actually exists for the purpose of fulfilling the aims of colonization. And so through doing my own kind of self-study and starting to grapple with some difficult questions, I was able to realize that much of what I understood about myself, including this, as I said, tendency to take on other people's gazes as my truth and my reality, I kind of woke up to the fact that actually that truth was so steeped and drenched in colonization that it was far removed actually from who I am and where I come from and what I'm about. And so it opened up a way for me to start to look at myself differently. So I started to read specifically books around Black identity within the Caribbean, the impact of enslavement, understanding the particular nuances of the type of colonization that my family comes from. So being Canadian born and also with family from Jamaica, it's British colonization as opposed to American colonization. And so there's some, for me anyway, significant differences there. Starting to grapple with the mourning that comes from having a truncated understanding of history, because if you are a person who is born in most parts of the West Indies, kind of history ends at the water's edge. Like, at some point your family was stolen and brought to those islands for enslavement, and everything about that identity has been washed away. The fact that I speak English is from colonization. My first name is from colonization. My last name is from colonization. So it's all these kind of biographical markers really come from that history. And so I started to, through reading, but also stepping into some more different types of modalities for exploration, such as constellation work or, even like therapy, but doing lots of reflection to try and both unpack the way that I've been habituated and the understanding of myself that I had from colonization, and to kind of replace that with new information about that helped to actually clarify and help me to see both the gifts and the trauma of the history that I hold as a person who comes from a background of enslavement, but also a background that's obviously very ancient, right? As a person of African descent, I come from the place that all humans come from. So there's a gift there in that. So that's been part of my journey as well. And it opened up, as I said, a sense of freedom about being able to kind of divorce myself from a lot of the harmful understandings that I held of myself, and to start to get into a place of questioning about what was possible. Really opened things up for me. one of the ways that I have been able to kind of steward myself through this journey of decolonization is actually through the influence of Black historians and other Black thinkers. And so one of the books that's been influential has been My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. The first time that I actually read that book, I bought that book and must have been in late 2017 or 2018. And I actually didn't read it until I was on my first trip to England. And it was interesting reading this book, and with that book, what he's exploring is kind of like the traumatic kind of, is like a traumatic understanding of many of the issues that we associate under the label of kind of social justice. And so I'm reading about the kind of traumatic history of so-called white folks. And, like the original kind of, like reading things about how London Bridge, for example, used to be a place of extraordinary violence, while being in a London cab driving over London Bridge kind of like thing. So it was interesting to be in that context, to be in a context that is, there's a lots of memorials and celebrations to British colonization, obviously in London, and to be reading some of these pieces of history really helped to shape my initial reading of that book. And what I found really helpful about it was the fact that it was aligned with the way of anti-racism and anti-oppression that I have since come to adopt. And I was in the process of adopting at that time, which was one that helped me to recognize and gave me language, actually. That was the biggest gift of many of the books that I read, and particularly that book, helped me to give language to an understanding that we are all as human beings in the same soup. So if we're looking at, for example, the impact of white supremacy or colonization, that I am also impacted and influenced by white supremacy and take on some of its values as my own. I think that's part of what shaped, again, that orientation towards other people's understanding of me. And so I started to get language around how we're essentially just playing different roles. And so that helped me to humanize the very people and circumstances that I have, that I had historically been really oppositional to. And in doing so, it helped to shape, as I said, and give language to my particular approach to addressing racism and other forms of oppression with an understanding of empathy and care, and yet still be able to interrupt and stop harm, but to do that in ways that don't model how I initially learned things about, in terms of calling things out and labeling people or behavior, but do things in such a way that allow me to give space for a fuller picture of what's happening when I am a person experiencing racism and other forms of oppression. So that book has been really essential. And yeah, another text that I want to point to is a book called Black and British by David Olusoga. And what was really helpful about that book, which I have read a couple of times now, is that, again, it was really important to me to be able to understand the kind of makeup of the colonization that I particularly came from. And I'm really fortunate. I count myself extremely fortunate now that I'm living in a time in which I can have a second view or a second look at the history that I've learned, say, for example, growing up in the school system here in Canada, but to be able to do that through the lens of Black historians who don't buy into the kind of white gaze and colonization. They're just really are about exploring and exposing perspectives and stories that don't get a lot of voice. And so that's been one of the other texts that's been really helpful for me and has really helped to shape the work that I do now. And I think has brought some, I don't know if unique, but different perspectives and understanding around how to explore this idea of people being able to show up in their full humanity, regardless of what their histories are, their backgrounds are. Yeah, it's really helped to shape and how it is that I engage with that work. We are so often kind of locked in patterns and locked in roles. And it's not just about, for example, my experience of a person who may be the target of someone's racism or oppression, but it's also the ways that I have been habituated to in ways that take away agency, power, and choice. So one of the things that I talk about in the work that I do is that for many people of color who have, for example, histories of enslavement or other forms in which they have been dehumanized, there is a habituated response to be deferential. So in my case, it's deferential to white people. And so that is a pattern response that is actually ancestral, in that part of the reason why it is that my particular line has survived is because people have learned, in order to survive, to be deferential. And so what that means then is that there's work that I can do to unpack that pattern. But it also means that if I'm in community with people who are wanting to support my full potential, that there are things that they can do in order to support me in showing up fully. Not only in supporting me, but in supporting us in terms of our collaboration. And we are always collaborating. It doesn't matter if you're a student, teacher, within families, across teams, within organizations, within, whatever, co-housing communities. So there are systemic ways that address the systemic kind of errors that have happened because of things like colonization, white supremacy, that can be put in place that account for the kind of habituated and harmful patterns that are present in how it is that we live and work. And so I'm really interested in how to support all kinds of organizations. So I work with church communities, I work with workplaces, I work with, community housing, activist groups. How can we bring in systems that prioritize the space for exploration of what living in one's full humanity look like, that prioritize actually being anti-racist or anti-oppressive, which I see as terms that are about remedying existing normative and standards. How can we engage in conversations, for example, that are wrought, that are difficult, that are challenging, and hold some level of care for not only being engaged in the conversation, but the impact that that conversation may have. If someone has perhaps said something or done something that is experienced as a microaggression, so they've experienced it in a way that has, taken away their dignity or has them being viewed as less, and so that may spark some kind of reaction. How can we make space for the reality of how complex these things are, and still hold some care for how it is that we address it? So this is what I spend all of my time doing. It's what I try to work towards in my personal relationships. It's what I try to give to the people that I'm in collaboration with in terms of my work, because I do think that that there are ways to do it. One of the ways that's come into my own life is that I do work around unpacking principles of nonviolence and using and unpacking nonviolent communication as a way to support these types of conversation and generating these kinds of changes that are transformative in nature. So coupling nonviolence and NVC with anti-racism, anti-oppression, with unpacking privilege, with unpacking power, and also other kind of people-centered systems like sociocracy, and also things like constellation. So there's different things that we can pull from, different modalities. Many of them have traditional, ancient, old backgrounds that we can pull into kind of formulating a new lens that's about examining what's standard and normative and is often disconnecting, to see if we can transform that into something that allows for more connection and holding. Oftentimes the question comes up like, that people who, for example, are really committed to this idea of supporting ways that they can show up in their own full humanity and to support others in doing so. And even with the lens of like anti-oppression, people, there's been lots of conversation, particularly after the spring of last year with the killing of George Floyd, lots of people examining what it means to actually be part of change that they would like to see. And so in addition to wrestling with the ideas, I actually am a very practically based trainer. So I kind of have this way of sharing things. Like when I start a class, I say, it's like if I teach it on Tuesday, you should be able to try something on Wednesday. And so one of the really practical tools or practical ways that we can respond is to is actually through curiosity. So one of the things that happens is, especially now, there's lots of conversation, as I said, particularly around power and privilege, is that people are encountering new language, they're encountering new concepts, they're encountering people who are establishing a kind of counter narrative to what's normative in order for them to have a sense of safety or community or space to be more human. So I was in a conversation with a friend of mine the other day, and one of the things that came up was around this question of, for example, defunding the police as a concept. And so this person was really struggling with this idea of defunding the police. And it was really clear in the conversation that they didn't actually have, that we weren't in a place of a shared understanding about what that term meant. And so what I walked that person through was like supporting them in being able to explore questions that they have about it. Not only understanding what the term means, but like, where is this movement for defunding the police coming from? What might be motivating it? So just to really start to ask some questions about, you've heard a term that you're not really that familiar with. You are having some kind of reaction to it because of whatever understanding that you hold to it. And so what can you be curious about while you're having that reaction? And so from there, you can imagine that someone could then explore, like, for example, that one of the movements that the defunding the police movement is attached to is Black Lives Matter. So and then they could look at what are, by going to a website or something, look at kind of like what are the fundamental principles of Black Lives Matter. They can start to ask questions of people who they might have some relationship with about whether or not they're for defunding the police and what they think the benefits are. So just by being curious, because so often what happens is we hear something, we have a reaction to it, and it's a natural reaction because we're talking about, in this case, a systemic change that can be quite significant. And in part because we're kind of conflict averse, we don't actually address that tension. And so one of the easiest ways to address that tension is by getting more information And so I really encourage people to like step into a place of curiosity. And then I also, one of my most favorite kind of tool from nonviolent communication is a self-empathy tool. And what I teach with a self-empathy tool is like, it's very useful for many things, but it's actually been integral to my own work around decolonization. Because with the self-empathy tool, we go through the kind of major blocks around NVC, which is observations. So what happened rather, feelings, what feelings is it stimulating in me, and then needs from those feelings, what is important to me, what do I want to have known, or what am I super curious about, and then the like a request or a stance, which is around how can I make room to kind of show up or to bring forward things that are important to me. So one of the ways that I use that as my own in like decolonizing my own way of thinking was actually around my growing understanding about how I think about my body. So as people can see, and as I've mentioned, I'm a big body person. And so I held on, my understanding of my body was that that I'm on a trajectory of short life and being unhealthy, because that has what has been true in my family. We have terrible lungs. Up until my mother's generation, women died by the time that they were in their 50s. That was quite common in my family. And what I realized was that, so that's the observation. And so obviously that I have feelings of like anxiety and tension and all kinds of feelings that came up for it. But the piece that I wanted to explore that was most important to me is how much of my understanding of what I'm capable of doing with my body actually comes from me. I want to be able to separate what comes from me as opposed to what comes from, again, these kind of oppressive systems that have views about women's bodies, about Black women's bodies, about women from the Caribbean, about enslaved women. And so from there, I have been able to step into a place of investigating what actually is mine in terms of the story of my body and what has actually been fed to me. So I've done that, and I've used different tools. So using that self-empathy process, I got to a place of like, I'm in constant kind of like engagement with this question, using things like constellation. I do a lot of journaling around it. It's a thing that I meditate on, and it has allowed me to move to a place of saying that this body has an inevitable end and a tragic end, to actually be curious about what I can do to actually shape something that's different. So these are a couple of ways, like curiosity in general, but also just taking the time to, when we're having feelings, give yourself the gift of processing what they mean. I mean, all feelings are useful, or they can be useful if you can interpret them into what's important, or the needs, as we say in NVC. So that's what I bring oftentimes when I'm doing this work as a coach, as a mediator, as a trainer, in doing organizational development, is how to engage with some sense of curiosity, being open to what can be discovered when we're in collaboration with people. And so that's one of the ways that, that this work shows up